exactly is a value bet? Now, a value bet traditionally is something that you think of, on the river, the flop, the turn, or something along those lines. But essentially, every bet you make is going to be a value bet before the flop. So when you raise with aces before the flop, you're making a bet hoping to attain some value from your opponents. Now, on the flop, when you feel like you have the best hand and you want your opponent to call, that would be a value bet. The opposite of that would be a bluff, and somewhere in the middle is, betting on the come, a situation where you have a draw, where you're looking to either hit the hand or, win the pot with a fold. Now, on the river, you're pretty much down to just two options. You're either value betting or you're bluffing. And you want to be clear about what you're doing. A lot of times I see players in a pot on the river where they have bottom pair and they bet and they're not really sure what they're doing. They're like, are you betting that as a bluff or are you betting that because you want your opponent to call? You should always be well aware before you make a bet, is this a value bet or is this a bluff? There's no such thing as a value bluff, okay? You might hear that term. It's like, I was value bluffing. No, you weren't. You just didn't know what you were doing. What you've noticed over the last 10, 15 years is bet sizing has gone way, way down on really dry boards. And there's a clear reason for this. So, on a board like, again, the dry boards that we describe, like, ace-7 deuce or deuce-deuce 3 or, queen-6 deuce, something along those lines. On those very dry boards, your opponent is either going to hit or they're going to miss. So essentially, this is a small ball sort of situation where if a small bet works the same as a larger bet, generally speaking, because both of you are not going to have much, the smaller sizing is going to work. And we've seen a further extreme of that where players are really downsizing because, again, there's not a lot of fear or worry about your opponent drawing out on you. There's no draw there. It's ace-7 deuce. If they either have the best hand or you have the best hand, there's not going to be a situation where it's like 8, 9, 10 with two spades. That's a very draw-heavy board where a lot of turn cards can come to cost you the pot. On an ace-7 deuce, there's not many turn cards that are going to be very, very scary on a board like that. As we've already established, after the flop, you're usually not going to have a really strong hand. If you have ace-king, you're big underdog to actually flop a pair. You're gonna have nothing more often than not. So because of that, when you are c-betting, you're generally going to be c-betting with the hopes of actually winning the pot right there. So let's say, for example, you raise with jack-9 of hearts on the button, and the flop comes king-7 deuce. We use that one a lot because it's a very dry board. In a situation like that, if there's 1,000 in the pot, okay, what is the correct bet size to choose? Well, if you bet 1,000, your opponent's probably going to fold if he doesn't have a king or a 7. But if you bet 750, they're also probably going to fold. What about 500? You really come to the conclusion that if they have nothing and you're going to steal this pot, that you can lower your bet size significantly. So you think about when you go buy a car and the sticker price says 10,000. You don't usually say, well, I'll pay the 10,000. How about 12? What you try to do is you try to negotiate. Say, you know what? Can I get it for 7,000? How about 6? How about 55? You win the battle with the car salesman when you pick the right price that is the lowest amount that allows you the biggest opportunity to continue to just still get the car. In the old days, when I used to play, the World Series of Poker events, the style of poker was a lot different. Players, adapted their raise size based on the hand that they had. So what that did was it sort of gave away a lot of information about what their holding was most likely to be. So, for example, if the blinds were 1,500 and they had a hand like 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, ace queen or ace king, they would make it like 400, which is a very large raise. Now, if they had aces, they'd only make it 300. If they had kings, they made it 300. If they had a hand like, 6, 7 suited and were trying to play tricky, they would make it a smaller raise. So what I learned from that was that the larger raise size was usually a pretty strong hand that they kind of wanted to get everybody out with. And the problem with that is it became far too easy for me to just discount certain hands from their range, and they became a lot easier to play against. So it's extremely important when you choose a raise size, whatever you're going to choose for yourself, that you keep it consistent whether you have 8s, whether you have pocket aces, whether you have ace-king or ace-queen. Otherwise, the more adept players are going to read into your bet sizing, and they're going to start to figure out, okay, I see. So this player's made it bigger. They have this hand. And that's true just in general of all strategy-based things when it comes to poker. What you're 3-betting with, what your sizing looks like. It shouldn't be different when you have aces versus like 10s or jacks. Whatever your sizings are for bluffs and value bets, they should look very, very similarly. You can make some adjustments here and there based on players, based on the fact that certain opponents won't know any better. So if I'm playing against like a real amateur player, I'm not going to worry so much about balancing my sizes. I'm going to make my value bets bigger and my bluffs smaller. But against really good players that are game theory optimal and they're paying attention, you can't get away with stuff like that. So if you're an amateur and you're watching this and you're saying, well, we understand the fold frequency and, my opponents should be folding more often if I make bigger bets. So when I'm bluffing, why don't I just bet more? Hey, sounds genius, right? And there's some truth to it because obviously when you do bet a larger amount, your opponents are more likely to fold. However, when they do call, you just lose a lot more chips, right? And most importantly, when you're analyzing, bet sizing in your opponents, understand they're doing that to you as well. Now, what I look for typically when I'm watching opponents is how they play, very strong hands, like nutted hands, like what is their sizing in those situations? And then what about marginal hands where they're like somewhat strong? And then what about the bluffs? And I try to look for some tendencies and patterns. And you'd be surprised how often people still fall into patterns where it might be as subtle as, a player betting 6,100 versus 5,800. Like mentally, there's a difference between those two numbers. The 58, maybe he's trying to let you know that sounds like more. It's 58. And 61 is like, I want to put more than 6, but not that much more than 6, so 61. So you can find subtleties in people's bet sizing when they, veer from a static strategy like that. And that's what I pretty much look for when I'm analyzing bet sizing.